We are taught to read a ruin as a wound, a broken thing, a place where something living once stood and now does not, and we are meant to feel the loss of it, the quiet ache of a hall gone silent. But there is a stranger thought, one that does not announce itself until you have spent many years walking among fallen stones, and it is this: a ruin is not the past. A ruin is a prophecy. It is the shape that every living kingdom is already taking, slowly, beneath its own banners and its own certainty. And nowhere in all of Khaz Modan is that shape laid more nakedly bare than in the cracked and sun-baked waste the dwarves came to call the Badlands. Most travelers who pass through it see nothing. A desert of dry earth and broken canyon, scoured by sandstorms that swallow the landmarks, fit only for coyote and cougar and the patient circling of buzzards. They call it empty, and they hurry on toward greener country. But the question that has followed me across the whole of my long life is the one this place asks more honestly than any other I have known. If a land can hold the bones of so many who believe themselves eternal, then what, precisely, do those bones teach us about the fate that waits for all the rest? I am Keeper Aldrich. In my youth I studied among the Kirin Tor in the floating city of Dalaran, and in the long middle of my life I walked with the Explorers League through ruins that older men had abandoned as hopeless. The Badlands. I came to know not from a book but from beneath my own boots, and of all the ground I have studied, none has taught me more, because it is the one place in Azeroth that refuses to lie. The honest land. Understand first what kind of country this is. The Badlands sit in the heart of Khaz Modan, that dwarven dominion in the south of the eastern kingdoms, reached from the west through the smoking throat of the searing gorge, and from the north through the green and watered bowl of Loch Modan. They lie by any honest map between Stormwind and Dun Moragh, between the human south and the dwarven north, and yet they belong to neither. Travelers mistake them for alliance land out of nothing but proximity. In truth, they have long been contested, walked more often by horde patrols and dwarven prospectors than by any settled people. A corridor more than a kingdom, a place one crosses on the way to somewhere that matters more. That is the first deception, and the land corrects it quickly. Spend any time within it, and you learn that the Badlands are not a road between important places. They are the important place, and they have simply outlived everyone who would have told you so. The land itself is the lesson. In gentler country, the earth hides its history. Forests grow over old battlefields. Grass softens the lines of vanished walls. Rivers carry away the ash. Memory is buried by the patient kindness of green and growing things, until a meadow is only a meadow, and no one recalls what bled into its soil. But nothing grows in the Badlands to perform that mercy. The rain does not come to wash the record clean. The cracked and stratified ground lies open to the sky like a book left spread upon a table, and every age that ever pressed down upon this place remains legible in the rock, layer upon patient layer, refusing to be forgotten and refusing to be forgiven. I have stood in the long canyon of the Lethlor Ravine at the eastern edge of the zone, where the stone is banded in colors that mark out unimaginable stretches of time, and I have understood, in a way no lecture ever managed, that the surface I walked upon was merely the most recent page. The buzzards turned overhead, the wind moved the dust in slow rivers across the flats, and beneath my feet, far beneath, lay the beginning of everything. For the great secret of the Badlands is not its emptiness, it is what its emptiness sits upon. This barren and discarded waste, this corridor that no one bothers to rule, happens to rest directly atop the deepest origin story on the whole of the continent. The most overlooked land in Khaz Modan is the lid of its oldest vault, and the dwarves who scratched at its surface for ore and relics did not, at first, have the faintest idea what slept beneath them, nor that in waking it they would learn the truth of where they themselves had come from. This is the pattern the Badlands will repeat again and again in deeper and stranger forms. A surface that seems to hold nothing, a depth that holds the answer to everything, and a people who walk across the lid for generations before they think to ask what the lid was made to keep. The vault beneath. To understand what lies under the Badlands, you must go back before the dwarves, before the orcs, before any kingdom that drew a border. You must go back to the makers themselves. The Titans came to this world while it was young, and they found, sleeping within its very flesh, a wounded power they meant to heal and order. To wage their long war against the ancient corrupting things that infested Azeroth, the Titans reached into the crust of the world and shaped servants from its raw material. From living stone and worked metal, they made the Titan forged, beings of immense strength, built to fight a war that mortals could not have survived to witness. And when that war was won, when the great enemies had been chained and buried but not destroyed, the keepers turned from making war to making order, and they used a device of terrible artistry, the forge of wills, to bring forth new races who would reshape the world into the form their masters desired. But creation, even the creation of gods, does not arrive perfect on its first attempt. The earliest designs to come from the forge of wills were too ambitious, too complex, and what emerged from them was not the elegant servant the keepers had imagined. What emerged were the troggs, stone-skinned and misshapen, brutish in mind and savage in temper, a failure measured against the standard their makers had set. The keepers refined their work, and the next generation to step from the forge was the answer they had wanted. The craggy and kind-hearted earthen, carved of magical living stone, who would dig the deep places of the world and raise its mountains. And here the makers faced a question that has nothing to do with stone and everything to do with the soul of any creator. What does one do with a failure that lives? The troggs were a mistake, by every measure the keepers could apply. But they breathed in their fashion. They moved. They were. The records are plain that the keepers, for all their cold and ordering purpose, could not bring themselves to unmake what they had made. Why they could not, those same records do not say. But there is something in the choice that follows that we might fairly read as shame, for rather than ending the troggs, the titanic watcher Ironia raised a vault beneath the earth, a chamber of stasis meant to hold the failed and the unwanted in an endless sleep, neither destroyed nor permitted to walk free. They named that vault Uldaman. That is the thing that sleeps beneath the Badlands, not a treasure house built for glory, a prison built for shame. The first thing the makers of this world did with their first mistake was to bury it where they would not have to look at it. And then they walked away, and the centuries closed over the place like water over a dropped stone. But Uldaman did not remain only a prison. In the ages that followed, the Titan Forged endured their own catastrophes. A keeper named Loken betrayed his kind, and a noble keeper named Tyr rose against him. And there was a war among the Maker's own servants that few mortal histories remember clearly. When that struggle drove the faithful into flight, it was the keeper Arcadus and Iron Aya who bore with them the most precious thing the Titans had ever set down in this world. Tyr did not live to complete the journey south. He fell on the road, spending his life to hold back the horrors sent to hunt them, and the two who remained carried their burden onward and brought it at last into Uldaman. What they carried were the discs of Norgannon. These are not ornaments, nor weapons, nor crowns. They are the memory of the world itself, vast records set down to transcribe the history of Azeroth as it unfolded, holding within them the whole account of the Titans' work, their experiments, their making of the earthen and the troggs, the very mechanism of the affliction that would one day be called the curse of flesh. Into the deep chambers of Uldaman, into the seat they named for Khaz Arcadus and Ironaya laid these records down, and they vowed to guard them with their lives, or with whatever, in beings of living stone, stands in the place of a life. So consider what the Badlands now concealed beneath their indifferent dust, a prison for the Maker's failure, and in the same buried halls, the complete and truthful record of how everything in this world had come to be. The shame and the history, sealed together in the dark, beneath a surface so barren that no one passing above would ever suspect that the answer to the oldest question in the world lay waiting, patient as stone, for someone to dig. What the Makers discarded, I have descended into Uldaman. I will not pretend the descent left me unchanged. You go down through chambers that no mortal hand designed, where the proportions are wrong for any living people, shaped for builders larger and colder than ourselves, and the deeper you go, the older the silence becomes. Stone guardians stand in the dark, constructs of living rock that do not sleep so much as wait, and at the lowest reach of all, the great keeper Arcadus holds his vigil over the record still, exactly as he was charged to do across a span of time that the mind cannot truly hold. There is something in that fidelity that humbles a man. He was set a task before our kind drew breath, and he keeps it yet long after the ones who gave it to him have gone. And there, in the deep, the records spoke. For when the dwarves of a later age finally broke into these halls, what they found rewrote everything they believed about themselves. They had thought themselves a people whole and original, sprung from their own mountains, owing nothing to anyone. The discs told them otherwise. They told them that the dwarves were not the Maker's first work, nor even their second, but the long downstream consequence of an experiment, and that the proud, stout folk of Ironforge were nothing other than the earthen transformed. For the earthen did not stay as they were made. The buried enemies of this world, the corrupting powers the Titans had chained but never killed, worked their malice upward through the very rock, and they laid upon the Titan-forged a slow and terrible change. It came to be called the curse of flesh, and it did exactly what its name declares. It turned beings of enduring living stone into soft and mortal flesh. The iron skin gave way. The endless lifespan shortened into the brief candle of mortal years. The earthen of Uldaman watched the change creep through their own ranks and were afraid, and many of them asked to be laid down in hibernation deep within the vault until some cure might be found. The clockwork servants who tended the place vowed to keep their slumbering kin and to maintain the wondrous machinery, even knowing the same fate would one day claim them too. And so the earthen slept in the dark beneath the Badlands. They slept while empires rose above them and fell, and when at last they woke, The change had finished its work upon them, and they did not rise as earthen. They rose as dwarves, mortal and warm and forgetful, and they wandered up out of the deep places into the mountains, and they built iron forge, and they forgot. They forgot so completely that when they later broke back into the very vault of their birth, they did not recognize it as a cradle. They thought it merely a ruin full of treasure. Here is the bitter symmetry the Badlands preserve, and it is the heart of what this place has to teach. The Maker's failure, the troggs, was sealed in Uldaman to be forgotten. The Maker's success, the earthen, also ended in Uldaman, also sealed in sleep, also forgotten, and woke as something other than what they had been. Failure and success arrived at the same dark room and the same long silence. The vault did not distinguish between them. Time does not distinguish between them. The thing the Makers were proudest of and the thing they were most ashamed of lie in the same buried halls beneath the same indifferent waste, and a traveler walking the surface cannot tell which mound of dust covers which. What does that reveal about the Makers themselves? They were as close to gods as this world has known, and yet they did the most mortal thing imaginable. They created, and then they left. They raised servants and shaped races and set down the memory of all of it, and then they turned their attention elsewhere and did not come back. Uldaman was not destroyed by an enemy. It was simply abandoned by the very powers that built it, left to the keeping of a few faithful constructs and the slow arithmetic of erosion. And from that single fact, a vault allowed to crumble rather than to fall, we may reasonably suppose something about endings in general. Creation on the grandest scale, it seems, closes not with some final battle but with something quieter and far more common. It ends in being walked away from. And that, perhaps, is the most honest thing the deep Badlands have to say. The end of a civilization is rarely a catastrophe. More often, it is an absence, a turning away, a maker who finds a new project and forgets to look back until the thing left behind is only stone, and the stone is only a question that no one alive remembers how to ask. The wounded earth. The Titans left, and the deep places fell quiet, but the surface of the Badlands did not stay empty for long. The honest land has no shortage of those who would carve their own brief chapter into it, and each one that came added another layer to the stratified record, never suspecting how shallow their mark would prove against the depth already buried beneath. The dwarves were the first to return in earnest, though they did not know they were returning. Driven by the discovery of Uldaman and the staggering truth it held, the prospectors of Ironforge and the scholars of the Explorers' League descended upon the Badlands, digging at the lid of their own forgotten cradle. They were hungry for the relics of their makers, hungry for the knowledge the discs promised, and in their digging they made the oldest mistake recorded in this place. They dug too deep, and they woke the failure. For the troggs had never died. They had only slept, sealed where Ironiah left them, for a span of time beyond counting. When the dwarven picks broke into their resting place, the buried mistake rose in fury and fell upon the diggers, and it slaughtered most of them where they stood. The survivors fled back toward Ironforge, and they did not flee alone. The troggs followed through the deep tunnels of the world, burrowing northward beneath the mountains, until the noise of a nearby settlement drew them aside, and they erupted into the gleaming gnomish halls of Nomrigan. The mistake the makers had buried beneath the Badlands, so that no one would ever have to face it, was, in the end, faced, after all, by descendants who did not even know what they were looking at. That is the trouble with burying a thing rather than ending it. The grave keeps, but it does not hold forever, and the ones who finally open it are never the ones who dug it. While the dwarves contended with what they had unearthed, the wider wars of the world reached into the Badlands as they reached everywhere. When the orcs first poured through the dark portal and broke the kingdoms of the south, the shadow of that great conflict fell across these wastes as well. Warriors of one of the Orcish clans escorted a monstrous two-headed ogre and his cult of fanatics across the Badlands toward Grim Batol, that he might look with his own eyes upon the oil refineries being made ready there for war. A company of human soldiers out of Stromgard still held watch in the region despite the horde's grip on Khaz Modan, and they died for it, cut down in the dust. The Badlands swallowed that bloodshed as it swallows everything, and left only the faintest trace in the record, a single grim line in histories that hurried on to grander battles elsewhere. Then, a generation after the orcs first crossed into this world, the horde planted its own banner in the waste. A fortress called Kargath rose here, named for a brutal warlord of the orcs, and it stood as the only horde outpost in all of Khaz Modan, a lonely fist of timber and iron in dwarven country. The war chief himself dispatched an expeditionary force to hold it, warriors charged with hunting down a renegade son of a fallen clan who had turned against the horde's new order. For a time, Kargath was a place of purpose, a garrison with a war to fight and a name to make. For a time. The Badlands grant such times generously and revoke them without warning. Through all of this, the eastern reaches of the zone harbored a darker tenant. In the Lethlor ravine and the surrounding flats, the black dragonflight made their nests. These were the brood of a corrupted aspect, dragons twisted from their ancient purpose into instruments of madness and ruin, and they bred their young in the canyons of the Badlands, far from the eyes that might have stopped them. To walk the eastern ravine was to walk beneath the wings of a dying lineage that did not yet know it was dying, raising its children in the shadow of its own corruption. I have seen the whelps wheel above those crags and felt the strange pity that comes from watching something doomed go about the business of continuing. And then came the shattering, and the Badlands learned that they had never truly known what ruin was. When the corrupted aspect, the great world breaker, tore his way up out of the deep places and broke the surface of the world, his passage carried him through the Badlands, and where he passed, he left a wound that the land wears to this day. A vast charred ravine was burned across the western reaches, the rock sliced open and set glowing with the fire of the deep, and it was given a name that needs no explanation to anyone who sees it. The scar of the world breaker. The avalanche that came with that upheaval buried the fortress of Kargath entirely, that proud, lonely outpost erased in a moment by falling stone, so that a new keep had to be raised nearby to take its place and its name. The purpose Kargath had been built to serve outlived the fortress itself by only the briefest span. The waste reclaimed it as the waste reclaims all things, and the new keep stands beside the grave of the old as a kind of unintended monument to how little our works are promised. Layer upon layer, then, the Maker's prison and the Maker's memory in the deepest dark. The troggs woken and the dwarves bled, the orcs and the humans who killed each other in passing, the garrison razed and buried, the dragons nesting in their corruption, and over all of it, the fresh black scar of a god's rage burned across the surface so recently that the rock has not yet had time to forget the heat. The Badlands hold them all, indifferent, refusing to rank one tragedy above another, refusing to let any of them fade. A world left behind. But the Badlands did not end on a note of pure ruin, and it would be a failure of honesty to end the telling there. For in the very years of the shattering, while the scar still smoked, this discarded land became the unlikely cradle of a hope that no greener country could have produced. A red dragon came quietly into the Badlands, cloaked in the guise of a goblin, so that none would know her flight. She had set herself a task that bordered on the unforgivable in pursuit of something close to redemption. She meant to find a way to purify the black dragonflight, to lift from at least one of its children the ancient corruption that had damned the whole brood, and to do it she captured a black dragon, a daughter of the Worldbreaker himself, and forced her to lay egg after egg for the work. The red dragon knew the cruelty of what she did. She had not forgotten that her own queen had once suffered the same captivity at other hands, and the memory gave her no peace. But she believed the future outweighed the crime, and she pressed on. And here the deepest layer of the Badlands reached up at last to touch its shallowest. For the means of the purification was not found in any temple of the dragonflights. It was a device of the Titans, recovered from ruins newly uncovered in the Badlands themselves, the same maker's work that lay scattered through this land like seed. A brilliant gnome turned that ancient instrument to a purpose its makers never imagined, and with it a wild egg, a fallen whelp, and an egg wrung from the captive mother. They made the thing they had hardly dared to hope for, a single black dragon egg, whole and uncorrupted, the first creature of that blighted line in untold ages, to carry no taint of the old corruption within it. The Worldbreaker came for it, of course. An aspect will go to terrible lengths to keep his own blood bound to his image, even when that image is madness, even when it is ruin, and the corrupted patriarch of that whole blighted line descended upon the Badlands to destroy the egg that defied him. He killed the red dragon who had made it, but she had foreseen her own death and prepared for it, and the egg he shattered in his fury was a decoy, her own, while the true purified egg had already been carried away in secret to safety, far from the waste. From that egg, in time, hatched a black dragon free of the corruption that had ruled his entire lineage, a prince who would take a new name and refuse the inheritance of the madness that ran in his blood. The whole of his blighted flight and the land where he was made had been a long descent into ruin. He was the one thing the ruin produced that the ruin could not corrupt. Consider what that means, set against everything else this land contains. Directly above the buried failures of the makers, directly beside the prison of the troggs and the cradle of the dwarves, on the same cracked ground scarred by a god's passage and littered with the graves of garrisons, the most discarded land in Khaz Modan brought forth the single uncorrupted child of a doomed line, by means of a tool the makers themselves had left behind and forgotten. The ruin did not only preserve the past, it supplied the instrument of the future. The makers walked away from their work, and ages later, their abandoned device became the means by which something new and unblighted entered the world. Nothing in the Badlands, it seems, is ever fully spent. What is buried is not gone. What is discarded is not done. This is the thing I carried up out of those canyons, the thing I have turned over in my mind through all the years since, and it is heavier and stranger than the wound I went down expecting to find. We are taught to read a ruin as a wound, a place of ending, a monument to what is lost. But the Badlands will not permit that easy grief. Layer upon layer, they show that the prison and the cradle are the same chamber, that the failure and the masterpiece sleep in the same dark and wake, if they wake at all, as something neither their makers intended, that the proudest fortress and the deepest vault are equally promised to the dust, and that the dust, in its patience, keeps everything and ranks nothing. The makers ended not in catastrophe, but in absence, in turning away, and so, in the end, does very nearly everyone. And yet from that same indifferent waste, from the maker's discarded tools and the corrupted brood's last clutch, came an uncorrupted thing that owed its existence entirely to what had been left behind. The Badlands are the most honest land in Azeroth, not because they teach us that all things fall. Any ruin teaches that. They are honest because they refuse to let the falling be the whole of the story. The same depth that holds the shame holds the record. The same waste that swallows the garrison cradles the egg. To walk the Badlands is to stand on the lid of every ending and feel, faintly, through the stone, the unkillable persistence of what comes after. So I return, at the last, to the question I carried into that country and could not carry back out unchanged. What can ruins teach us about the fate of every civilization? I had thought, when I was younger, that the answer would be a warning, that ruins exist to remind the proud that they too will fall, that every banner becomes a stratum, every kingdom a layer in some honest and pitiless rock. And that is true, and the Badlands say it more plainly than anywhere I know. But it is not the whole of what they say. The deeper lesson, the one that took an old man a lifetime to hear, is that a ruin is not the end of a thing. It is the keeping of it. The makers did not destroy their failure, and so it survived to teach. The earthen did not perish, only slept and changed, and rose again wearing a new name. The records were not lost, only buried, only waiting. Even the most discarded land holds, beneath its indifferent dust, the seed of whatever comes next, in forms its makers never meant and could not have foreseen. Perhaps that is the fate of every civilization then, not to vanish, but to be left behind, and in being left behind, to become the ground from which the next thing grows. The Badlands keep their dead without sentiment and without despair. They simply keep them, layer upon patient layer, the prison beside the cradle, the scar beside the egg, the shame beside the truth, all of it legible to anyone willing to stop and read the open book of the broken earth. I have read what I could of it. The rest waits, as it has always waited, for whoever comes after. And the wind moves the dust in slow rivers across the flats, and the buzzards turn, and far below, in the dark, where the makers laid their failures and their memories side by side, the great keeper holds his vigil still, guarding a history that the living have only begun to learn how to ask about.